Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the People Culture Marxist Library. And I see most of you have been here before, so I don't need to give you that particular spiel. But some of you may have woken up this morning, tune it up, and listen to the news. Whoa. Everybody will hear. Okay. And you may have noticed that, let me see here. Yes, may have heard the spiel about International Women's Day, and you probably got a lot of nonsense where various corporations and other people are, let's celebrate International Women's Day. And that, I think you all kind of sense that there's some travesty there, that the corporations did not invent International Women's Day. In fact, it was invented by socialists towards the turn of the century. And I want to read something to you because many people, oh, this is a great day. We're put a whole day aside for women and so forth. But I wanted to read something that one of my favorite feminists and Marxists, Alexandra Kollontai, wrote on International Women's Day. She said, "This is not a special day for women alone. The 8th of March is a historic and memorable day for the workers and peasants, for all the Russian workers, and for the workers of the whole world. On this day, in 1917, the women of Petrograd raised the torch of proletarian revolution and set the world on fire. After the experience of the Russian October Revolution, it is clear to every working woman in France, in England, and in other countries that only the dictatorship of the working class, only the power of the Soviets can guarantee complete and absolute equality." And I think we need to know that it was international women of Petrograd that set the world on fire, overthrew the Tsar, and set the stage for the October Revolution. And not only that, after they overthrew the Tsar, the bourgeoisie were setting up their own bourgeois government. And they put out their statement. I guess it was a draft constitution for the new Republic of Russia, or whatever they called it. But they put this out, and the women looked at it and they said, "How about us? You haven't said anything in here about the rights of women." So 40,000 of them marched across Petrograd to the Duma, sat in and said, "We're not leaving until there is a section on the right of women to vote." They did not leave, and the Duma came out with the first version, a revised version, which guaranteed the right of women to vote. And that's how Russia became the first national state to guarantee the right of women to vote. Some other places did it a little bit earlier. Oregon, I think, 1910, 12 or something. But Russia was the first nation to do this. 1917. And then in the, again, by overthrowing the Tsar, they set in motion the October Revolution, which, as you know, which Lenin said struck more deeply at the roots of women's oppression than any other revolution in history. And they put in their constitution an equal rights clause guaranteeing the right equality for women, something that we do not have here, as you know. So I just wanted to say a few things on that because I think it's important to stress. Okay, we could talk later on that, okay? We don't like to have people just speaking up on their own, please. Because we're here to listen to one of our favorite people, Grover Furr, needs no introduction, but Raj is going to introduce him anyway. Pardon? He's going to introduce me anyway. Right, he's going to introduce you anyway. So.
Gene asked me, I have to. Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Grover Furr, even though he does not need any introduction to the people in this room. Um, he came here 2011 when he wrote the book titled Khrushchev Lied. And I had a camera and I videotaped that. And I had never put anything up on YouTube, and I put it up on the YouTube. And it was a very amateurish thing to do because I didn't do it properly, but it was there. So today we have on YouTube, he's the most watched uh, person from this library. We have, I think, over 100 programs now, and you have the most comments, most positive comments, and also there are negative comments, as you know. So I've been following Grover Furr's work, and as soon as his book comes out, I don't set it down until it's finished, and I keep looking for more. So here, without saying anything further, he has a number of books here, and there's a list of books, but I'll not go over them because that'll waste time. I might as well ask Grover to speak to you at this point.
Thank you, Rod, for your generous remarks, and thanks to Gene and want me to speak with this?
Yes.
Okay. Sure.
It's on.
It's already on? Yes. I
Yes.
I pushed the button.
No.
This?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll use this then. Okay. All right. Well, Gene said some very important words about International Women's Day. I'll say something very briefly about it because it should not, of course, go without its proper recognition. Today is the day we celebrate the struggles of working class women. Founded in 1910, it was long a holiday only in the Soviet Union and after World War II in the pro-Soviet socialist countries. It was primarily a communist holiday until the 1960s. It stands as a reminder to us both of the struggles of working women worldwide and of the achievements of the communist movement. So, let me begin my address here. In 1843, Karl Marx wrote these words, quote, "It is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of the conflicts with the powers that be. Ruthless criticism of all that exists. Marxists are supposed to be materialists. Dialectical materialism is a science. But few Marxists act like materialists. Most Marxists believe Khrushchev, believe Gorbachev, believe Trotsky, and believe the Western anti-communist academics who write about Soviet history. Objectivity. The only way to arrive at the truth in any investigation is to proceed with objectivity. A scientist tries to be objective, meaning to question, to doubt her own biases, and not to permit those biases, which everyone possesses, to predetermine the results of her analysis. Therefore, we have to recognize our own preconceived ideas and prejudices, and then take definite steps to doubt them, to question them, lest they fatally bias our investigations. We have to work out a method of looking with particular skepticism upon evidence that tends to support our own prejudices and preconceived ideas. We also need to give especially generous consideration to any evidence that tends to contradict our own prejudices and preconceived ideas. If we fail to do this, we will do the opposite. Inevitably, we will give an especially generous reading to evidence that tends to support our preconceived ideas, and be quick to reject any evidence that tends to disprove our preconceived ideas. We will fall prey to confirmation bias. Then we will have no chance at all of discovering the truth, for even if we stumble upon it, we will not recognize it. Anti-communists are never objective. They can't afford to be, because the evidence does not support their anti-communist falsehoods and fabrications. Virtually none of the anti-communist academic scholars who write about Stalin-era Soviet history make any attempt to be objective. Practice is primary, theory is secondary. Lenin wrote that, quote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement." True enough. But what makes theory revolutionary? That the theory is tested by an accurate understanding of the world, which is gained through practice. Here are some quotations from Lenin on practice. Replying to Dühring, who had attacked Marx's dialectics, Engels said that Marx never even thought of proving anything by means of Hegelian triads, that Marx only studied and investigated the real process, and that he regarded the conformity of a theory to reality as its only criterion. Again, from living perception to abstract thought, and from this to practice, such is the dialectical path of the cognition of truth, of the cognition of objective reality. Again, man by his practice proves the objective correctness of his ideas, concepts, knowledge, science. Lenin again, life gives rise to the brain. Nature is reflected in the human brain. By checking and applying the correctness of these reflections in his practice and technique, man arrives at objective truth. Truth is a process. From the subjective idea, man advances towards objective truth through practice. Again, practice is higher than theoretical knowledge, for it has not only the dignity of universality, but also of immediate actuality. Again, the unity of the theoretical idea of knowledge and of practice, and this, note especially, and this unity precisely in the theory of knowledge. And finally, one final quotation from Lenin. Testing by facts or by practice, respectively, is to be found here in each step of the analysis. So, to the extent that Marxist theorists are divorced from practice, they are not in reality Marxists at all, not according to Lenin. Marxists who are ignorant of the practice of the first Soviet state, the Soviet Union, during its most dynamic period, the so-called Stalin period from 1929 through 1953, who have based their interpretation of the practice of the Soviet Union on anti-communist lies, cannot learn from the practice of the communist movement of the past, because they are ignorant of what that practice was. And in fact, they have uncritically ingested a false and slanderous version of that practice from the writings of Leon Trotsky, from Nikita Khrushchev and his hired historical liars, from Mikhail Gorbachev and his hired historical liars, from Western anti-communist so-called scholars, and from anti-communist scholars of today. Such stealth-styled Marxists do harm by claiming the status of Marxist and communist while spreading lies within the left about Soviet history, fatally misleading younger or naive persons who, disgusted with capitalism, want to learn how to fight for communism. In a review of the book by Phil Slater, Origin and Significance of the Frankfurt School, Terry Eagleton wrote, as a Marxist himself, Slater puts an accurate finger on the central devastating disability of the whole school. He's talking about the Frankfurt School. Its chronic inability to bring its theorizing into any productive relationship with political practice. This criticism, in fact, includes all Trotskyists, whose understanding of history is based upon belief in the anti-communist lies about Stalin and the Soviet Union of his day, and on the cult of Leon Trotsky. 6 words. In my years of researching Soviet history of the Stalin period, I have discovered a number of central falsehoods that characterize dishonest, that is to say, non-objective, non-scientific, pseudo-research about this field. I will discuss 6 of the most important falsehoods here. They are totalitarianism, Stalinism, dictator, terror, the Gulag, and democracy. 1. Totalitarianism. Here is the definition of totalitarian from the Oxford English Dictionary. of or pertaining to a system of government which tolerates only one political party, to which all other institutions are subordinated, and which usually demands the complete subservience of the individual to the state. When this term came into use in the 1920s and 30s, it was applied to Christianity, to Italian fascism, and to total war. But it has also long been used by anti-communists to claim that communism is similar to fascism. According to, Yuri Felshtinsky and George Chernyavsky, both very pro-Trotsky and super anti-Stalin authors of the latest comprehensive Russian language biography of Leon Trotsky in 5 volumes, write about this. They say, or they claim that Trotsky was the first to use the term totalitarian about Stalin. Here's what they say. Trotsky, is a quotation, Trotsky became the first author to include the Stalin period under the general theme of totalitarianism, and, unprecedented for a communist, went so far as to compare 3 dictators, the Bolshevik leader Stalin with the fascist Duce Mussolini and the National Socialist Furr Hitler. And again, this is from Felshtinsky and Chernovsky, the authors of this very extensive biography of Trotsky and who are extremely anti-Stalin. Quote, in the vocabulary of Trotsky and in the book Stalin, that's his biography of Stalin, the term totalitarian power was entered to denote the nature of Stalin's political rule. Okay, the bottom line for us, whatever totalitarian may mean, the Soviet Union during the Stalin period was not totalitarian. But here is the Trotskyist site, Marxist.org. Quote, Stalin's regime is probably the most effective totalitarian regime in history. That's from Marxist.org. More about that site in the future. 2, Stalinism. Just as Leon Trotsky was the first to apply the term totalitarian to the Soviet Union during the period of Stalin's leadership, so he was the first to use the term Stalinism. The Oxford English Dictionary again, 1927, the Daily Telegraph, 22nd of November. A violent denunciation of Stalinism and its terrorizing of the party. This article in the Daily Telegraph, it's the first citation in the English language of the word Stalinism, is an article about the demonstrations by Trotsky and other oppositionists during the November 7th, 1927 parades in honor of the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Trotskyist site Marxist.org states, quote, Stalinism lasted longer and was more total than fascism. But fascism and Stalinism share in common that they rested on absolute terror. Marxist.org recognizes that Stalinism does not have any fixed meaning. Quote, getting at the core definition of Stalinism is difficult, but not impossible. Again, a quotation from Marxist.org. The political tenets of Stalinism revolve around the theory of socialism in one country, developed by Stalin to counter the Bolshevik theory that the survival of the Russian Revolution depended on proletarian revolutions in Europe. In contradistinction, the Stalinist theory stipulates that a socialist society can be achieved within a single country. End quote. This is false. Marxist.org continues. Quote, in April 1924, in the first edition of his book, Foundations of Leninism, Stalin had explicitly rejected the idea that socialism could be constructed in one country. He wrote, quote, is it possible to obtain the final victory of socialism in one country without the combined efforts of the proletarians of several advanced countries? No, it is not. Marxist.org continues, quote, by November 1926, Stalin had completely revised history, they say, stating, quote, the party always took as its starting point the idea that the victory of socialism can be accomplished with the forces of a single country, end quote. This is a lie. Note that in these quotations, Stalin spoke of the victory of socialism, not the final victory of socialism. Even in the short course, that's the history of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, a short course published in Russian in 1938 and in English in 1939, that is 15 years after the passages that the Marxist.org page quoted, Stalin wrote, quote, The victory of socialism in the Soviet Union, as expressed in the abolition of capitalist economic system and the building of a socialist economic system, could not be considered a final victory. The Marxist.com writers must know this text. It's on their site. Therefore, they're deliberately ignoring it. The Trotskyists are lying when they claim that the theory of socialism in one country meant that Stalin had abandoned, quote, the Bolshevik theory that the survival of the Russian Revolution depended on proletarian revolutions in Europe. This kind of falsehood is known as bias of omission. The Marxist.org article claims that Lenin rejected the idea of socialism in one country. This, too, is false. In reality, Lenin clearly stated that socialism could be achieved in one country. Here are some quotations from Lenin. Quote, uneven economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. Hence, the victory of socialism is possible first in several or even in one capitalist country alone. That was 1915. Again, quote, the development of capitalism proceeds extremely unevenly in different countries. It cannot be otherwise under commodity production. From this it follows irrefutably that socialism cannot achieve victory simultaneously in all countries. It will achieve victory first in one or several countries, while the others will for some time remain bourgeois or pre-bourgeois. That was 1916. A final quotation from Lenin. Quote, indeed, the power of the state over all large-scale means of production, political power in the hands of the proletariat, the alliance of the proletariat with the many millions of small and very small peasants, the assured proletarian leadership of the peasantry, etc. Is this not all that is necessary to build a complete socialist society? It is still not the building of a socialist society, but it is all that is necessary and sufficient for it. And that's Lenin in 1923. The Marxist.org evidence? They have none. Trotsky claimed that Lenin rejected the idea of socialism in one country. That's it. No evidence, just a claim by Trotsky. Marxist.org's conclusion, quote, Stalinism has uprooted the very foundations of Marxism and Leninism. That, of course, is false. This has long since been proven false, but most of their readers know nothing or next to nothing about Soviet history, and so are vulnerable to anti-Stalin and pro-Trotskyist falsifications. 3. Stalin the dictator, in quotation marks. There is a great deal of evidence that Stalin was not a dictator, and no evidence that he was one. In 2004, hi Sharon. In 2004, Stefan Wheatcroft, a leading academic specialist in the Stalin period, published an article titled, quote, From Team Stalin to Degenerate Tyranny. That's the title of his article. Wheatcroft's whole article concerns Stalin's dedication to collective leadership. But wait a minute, what about that degenerate tyranny part? This is only mentioned in the last few sentences with no evidence. Wheatcroft ends his article in this way. But at the same time, he, Stalin, grew increasingly unhappy with this dependency and began to take erratic and tyrannical decisions. That's it. End of article. But what decisions? In 2004, Wheatcroft could not identify even a single act of dictatorship or tyranny by Stalin, nor can anyone else do so today. In his infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress on February 25, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev made a number of claims about strange decisions that Stalin supposedly made during his last years. In my book, Khrushchev Lied, I show that every such statement by Khrushchev in that speech is false, except for one that I can't prove either true or false. There have been a few attempts by Western anti-communist scholars, or so-called scholars, to argue that Stalin was indeed a dictator. All rely on asserting that the Moscow trials defendants were innocent, that the famine of 1932-33 was caused by collectivization, if not actually desired by Stalin, that the Tukhachevsky affair military defendants were innocent, and that the Great Terror, discussion to come below, was indeed willed by Stalin. None of this is true, as I have proven from primary source evidence in my books and articles during the past decade. But in the dishonest field of Soviet history, it is obligatory to call Stalin a dictator. 4. The Great Terror. Under this heading, Marxists.org cites a list of worthless anti-communist material from the 1930s, plus Trotsky's own lies. They lead off with the following words in small print. Quote, statistics based on archival sources, but nonetheless approximate numbers. Executed 1930 to 53, 786,098. Imprisoned, 3.5 million. Death in prison and exile, 2 million. Well, whoa. 3.5 million imprisoned for the period 1930 to 53, 23 years, is a small figure. More than 2 million persons are imprisoned in the United States today, and the Soviet Union went through several catastrophes during these years. Died in prison and exile is misleading. Several 100,000 prisoners died while in the Gulag, but 60% of those died during the Great Famine of 1932 to 33, or the Second World War in 1942 to 44. During these periods, a great many Soviet citizens were also dying prematurely. During the war, Soviet workers sickened and died of starvation at their workplaces, far from any fighting. Here are some quotations. One is from Chilayev, the chief prosecutor of Chelyabinsk province in 1943. Quote, the high intensity of work at the factory and the inadequacy of the food make it a matter of urgency that workers receive their rightful days off. During the war, it was 2 days a month, as witnessed by the frequency with which workers are dropping dead from emaciation right on the job. On some days, you see several corpses in the shops. During the 2 months, December 42 and January 43, they observed 16 bodies just in the factory shops. Those dying from emaciation are mainly workers doing manual labor. This is from an article by Donald Filtzer titled Starvation Mortality in Soviet Home Front Industrial Regions During World War II. Filtzer is an anti-communist scholar who specializes in studying the Soviet working class. He states, quote, during 1943 and 1944, starvation and tuberculosis, a disease that was endemic to the Soviet Union and is highly sensitive to acute malnutrition, were between them the largest single cause of death among the non-child civilian population. End quote. Filtzer continues, quote, the Soviet Union did not have enough food to feed both its military and its civilians, even with the arrival of Lend-Lease food aid. The state therefore had to engage in a grim calculus and decide how it could most efficiently use its limited resources. That is, how many calories and grams of protein it could allot to different groups. In those circumstances, it was inevitable that some people would not obtain enough to eat and many would die. Final quotation. No matter what regime had been in power in the Soviet Union, Stalinist, Trotskyist, Menshevik, or capitalist, it would have faced the same set of choices. Marxist.org's exile figure is meant to imply that these persons died because they were in exile. In reality, it simply meant that people, mainly former kulaks and their families, eventually died at the places to which they had been exiled. Normally, they were exiled to work on collective farms. Most of these deaths must have been natural. Old age, the normal run of diseases, and of course the famine and the war. How about executed? According to the Pavlov report made to Khrushchev in December 1953, and the results of the research of Oleg Mazukhin, an expert in the NKVD archives today, the figures of persons executed from 1936 to 1939 in the Soviet Union are as follows. 1936, 1,018. 1937, 353,074. 1938, 328,618. 1939, between 2,500 and 2,600. 1940, between 1649 and 1863. Slight difference between these two ways of calculation. Total for 1937 to 38, 681,692, or 86.7% of the total executed between 1930 and 1953. Question: what happened in 1937 to 1938? Good question. Answer, Nikolai Yezhov, Commissar, that is the head of Internal Affairs, that is head of the NKVD, was killing as many people as he could in order to stir up anger and resentment among the Soviet population. His plan was to seize power in the Soviet Union for himself by recruiting an army, or at least rebel bands, from the discontentment so created when the Japanese and or Germans attacked the Soviet Union. The primary source documents showing this have been available for over a decade now. In 2010, I wrote an online article summing this up in much more detail. To it, I attached all the confessions of Yezhov in 1939 and 1940 in both the original Russian and in English translation. It's on my homepage. If you want to look it up, the title is, quote, The Moscow Trials and the Great Terror of 1937-38, What the Evidence Shows. In January 2017, I published a full-length book on this same subject. I think Marilyn has a copy, right? Yeah, so I don't have one here, but you can hold it up. Okay, that's it. Thank you, Marilyn. Title is Yezhov versus Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the Soviet Union. On Sunday, July 30th, 2017, I gave a talk on my book and on this subject generally here at the Nebel Proctor. I also published an article in which I try to summarize the main points of my book. I have brought it copies here. It's also linked on my homepage. More about that later. The Trotskyist Marxist.org and all the anti-communists start the Great Terror, or claim the Great Terror started at the 1936 Moscow trial, and carry it through either the March 1938 Moscow trial, that's Marxist.org, or to the end of the Yezhovshchina in November 1938. In reality, the defendants at the Moscow trials, plus at the Tukhachevsky affair military commanders, were all guilty. I have identified, located, and studied the primary source evidence, of which we now have a great deal. See my books, Trotsky's Amalgams, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, The Fraud of the Dewey Commission, Trotsky's Lies, and Stalin Waiting for the Truth, as well, of course, as Yezhov versus Stalin. Some of these other books are here on the table. 5, the Gulag. Every country has a penal system. The only sensible questions to ask, in my view, are the following. 1, were the persons confined in the penal system actually guilty of the crimes of which they were accused? 2, what were the conditions of life and work in the penal system? The Gulag was a penal administration. That's what Gulag means. It doesn't mean a camp. It's administration. It included prisons, labor camps, and exile settlements. Many of those in the exile settlements were former kulaks, peasants rich by comparison with their neighbors who employed labor. Others were those who opposed collectivization with force. As the objective research of Mark Tauger, a professor of Soviet studies and Soviet agriculture at the University of West Virginia, as his research has shown, collectivization was essential to put an end to the endless cycle of devastating famines that had occurred every 3 to 5 years in Russia, including Ukraine, for at least 1,000 years. There is a great deal of primary source evidence about the Gulag. Let's just talk about mortality rates. The highest mortality rates were 15.3% in 1933, 24.9% in 1942, and 22.4% in 1943. 1933 was the year of the Great Famine, in which at least 3 million persons died either of starvation or, more frequently, of diseases caused or made worse by poor nutrition, that is to say, famine. 1942 and 43 were the hardest years of the war, when millions of Soviet citizens were dying either in the military at the hands of the Nazis and their allies, or from overwork and undernourishment behind the lines. It needs to be noted that the prisoners in the labor camps were paid for their work, both in money and in time off their sentences. They were encouraged, but not forced, to remain as regular workers once they had been released, and many did. Here are some facts about conditions of work in the Gulag. Okay, from Dmitlag, Regulations of October 9th, 1932. Here's a quote. Wake up, 5:30 a.m. Breakfast, 5:45 to 6:30 a.m. Travel to work, 6:30 to 7 a.m. Work, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., 12 hours. Dinner, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. From 7 p.m. to 10 p.m., cultural and educational activities. From 10:05 p.m., retreat and sleep. Okay? The following quotation, end quote. The following quotation is taken from the Russian Wikipedia page on the Dmitrovsky Correctional Labor Camp. Here's the quotation. The construction of the Moscow Canal was widely used by Soviet propaganda. In the place of the House of Culture of the Dimitrov excavator plant on Bolshevik Street, until the end of the 1950s, there was a club called the Gulag. The club held festive celebrations and meetings of the leading workers. Here in August 1934, Maxim Gorky, Soviet writer, spoke at a meeting of the leading workers of the construction of the Volga-Moscow Canal. Nearby is the beautiful building of the Dmitrovsky electric grid of the Moscow Canal Management, which was built during the construction of the canal. In Dmitlag, this is the Gulag, okay? Up to 10 newspapers and magazines were published simultaneously, including several different languages of the peoples of the Soviet Union. A library fund and its own film studio functioned. There were sports and educational sections and divisions, as well as its own brass bands and theater. Construction teams engaged in non-mechanized heavy physical work and performing scheduled tasks were provided with a 5-day rest period in February to April 1935, and the fight against parasites, lice, and nits was conducted. Nikita Petrov, a fire-breathing anti-communist and anti-Stalin writer, and a top officer of the Memorial Society in Russia, an anti-communist organization, nevertheless writes as follows, quote, 1935. On January 14th, Order Number 39 declared the composition of the sections of the Dynamo Camp Society, colon, rifle, ski, speed skating, hockey, auto section, horse, gymnastics, defense and attack, which means wrestling, hunting, chess and checkers, medical control, campaign propaganda sector. Abuses, of course, occur in every penal system. We know about these abuses in the Soviet Gulag mainly from the materials compiled during the investigations of abuses by central authorities. During the period when he headed the NKVD, September 1937 to November 1938, Nikolai Yezhov was leading a conspiracy aimed at overthrowing the Soviet government and party. He admitted to putting his men in charge of the labor camps and creating good conditions for criminals and anyone loyal to himself, and bad conditions for other prisoners. Yezhov's confession has been available for many years. I have reproduced it as an appendix to my 2010 article, about which more later. I discuss these confessions in chapters 13 and 14 of Yezhov versus Stalin. However, I have never yet encountered a book by a mainstream scholar of Soviet history who mentions, let alone quotes, any of these passages in Yezhov's confession about his use of the Gulag and his conspiracy. Accounts of the Gulag agree that conditions in the camps were bad during 1937 to 38 and improved immediately upon Beria's taking over the NKVD from Yezhov. Yezhov's account here explains this. This fact also helps to exonerate the Stalin leadership, since it was they who replaced Yezhov with Beria. Once Yezhov was recognized for the conspirator he was and removed from office, conditions in the Gulag camps improved immediately. In his book, Origins of the Great Purges, Arch Getty, a well-known American scholar of Soviet history, writes as follows. I'm going to quote from Getty's book. Quote, Yevgenia Ginsburg, who was in Yaroslavl prison and who saw no newspapers, said that the prisoners could tell when Yezhov fell. The draconian regime in the prisons, frequent solitary confinement, deprivation of all privileges, was relaxed one day. The timing was confirmed a few days later when Beria's name began to appear in official prison notices. End quote. Point 6, 6 of the 6 words. Democracy. Democracy. We are constantly being told that the Soviet Union was not democratic, while the Western capitalist and imperialist societies were democracies. This is all wrong. Neither the United States nor any other capitalist country is a democracy, in the sense that working people understand. No matter which party wins the voting, the ruling class continues to rule and nothing much changes. Reforms are incremental at best, and that only when there are massive, bold, and militant reform movements, such as have rarely existed in American society. In The State and Revolution, his famous book of 1917, Vladimir Lenin described capitalist democracy as follows, quote, Marx grasped this essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analyzing the experience of the Paris Commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representative of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament, end quote. That's Lenin in 1917. He was simply stating, with a class analysis and from a revolutionary Marxist standpoint, what many in the capitalist world had already recognized. There was no democracy in the self-styled so-called democratic capitalist countries. In 1925, Walter Lippmann, Harvard-educated advisor to presidents, acknowledged this. In the first sentence of his 1925 book, The Phantom Public, Lippmann wrote, quote, the private citizen today has come to feel rather like a deaf spectator in the back row who ought to keep his mind on the mystery up there, but cannot quite manage to keep awake. This is about elections. Media historian Michael Schudson describes Lippmann's dissection of the fallacies of democracy as follows, quote, a problem arises only if someone objects to current policy insofar as there is general agreement, the public has no interest in politics and should have no interest. The people do not govern and should not govern. At most, they support or oppose the individuals who do rule. End quote. Non-Marxist academic experts, such as G. William Domhoff of University of California at Santa Cruz, have applied the research methods of academic sociology and shown the specific mechanisms whereby the wealthiest financial, industrial, mercantile, etc. capitalists in the United States control not only elections, but the policies of the government, no matter what party rules. Even clearer than the analysis of how the ruling class rules at home is the record of imperialism. The European imperialists in the United States could have instituted democracy in the countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that they ruled. They never did so. On the contrary, whenever something that looked as though something like Western-style democracy seemed to be forming in places like Nicaragua, Haiti, Iran, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and so forth, the U.S. rulers stamped it out with force and reinstalled fascist-style dictatorships. The Western imperialists had the opportunity to establish democracy all over their empires, but they never did it. Instead, they used massive violence to plunder their colonial possessions for cheap raw materials, as markets to dump their overproduction, and as sources of cheap labor. When people in colonial countries, often led by communists, but not always, fought for independence or even for reforms, they were suppressed by force. Often this massive violence was described as, quote, fighting communism. Don't use Marxist.org. I have already quoted from Marxist.org's lies about Stalin, totalitarianism, and terror. Here are a few more that can't be discerned from rhetoric alone. To see through these, you have to know something about Soviet history. But few users of Marxist.org do, and so they are vulnerable to the lies of this dishonest site. Here is Marxist.org, the entry on Lavrenti Beria. Quote, leader of the NKVD from 1938 until Stalin's death, responsible for countless murders on his own initiative as well as on Stalin's orders, end quote. In reality, Beria was People's Commissar for Internal Affairs from December 1938 until December 1945, and again from March 15th until June 26, 1953, not from 1938 until Stalin's death. I mean, that's very well known. B, Marxist.org does not mention even one single murder, much less countless murders. Where did they get this stuff? From anti-communists. There's no place else. C, there is no evidence that either Beria, or for that matter Stalin, ever ordered anyone killed. Here's Marxist.org on Sergei Kirov. Kirov was the head of the Leningrad Party up until his murder in December the 1st, 1934. Quote, in the summer of 1932, Joseph Stalin became aware that opposition to his policies were growing. Some party members were publicly criticizing Stalin and calling for the readmission of Leon Trotsky to the party. When the issue was discussed in the Politburo, Stalin demanded that the critics should be arrested and executed. Kirov, who was up to this time had been a staunch Stalinist, argued against this policy. When the vote was taken, the majority of the Politburo supported Kirov against Stalin. I have three more paragraphs of quotation. It's all in the same vein. Let me get to the point. This is completely false. None of this happened at all. These are rumors that were floating around among Trotskyist Mensheviks and White Russian immigrants in Europe during the 1930s. There has been plenty of research on Kirov since 1989. I wrote a book about it, but there's lots of others. Marxist.org ignores all of it in order to repeat ancient Cold War lies from 1951 and 1964, which is where those quotes come from. Marxist.org has many important texts. These texts give credibility to the site as a whole. The non-text sections, the so-called encyclopedia and historical sections, are Trotskyist anti-communism. I urge everyone, whether Marxist or not, to boycott this site, except when seeking a text that can't be found on alternative, non-Trotskyist sites like marxtomao.com. Conclusions. 1. Reject as propaganda any account of Soviet history during the Stalin period that, by its rhetoric, moralizing, loaded language, vituperation, etc., shows that the author is not objective. 2. Reject as propaganda all accounts that refer to the Soviet Union as totalitarian, that use the terms Stalinist or Stalinism, that call Stalin a dictator, that claim the Soviet Union was ruled by terror, or who use the term Great Terror instead of Yezhovshchina or Bad Time of Yezhov, that refer to the Gulag as death camps or the prisoners of slaves, that claim that capitalist and imperialist states are democracies. Reject it. 3. Reject as propaganda any work that in any way attempts to compare the Stalin-era Soviet Union to Hitlerite Germany or Stalin to Hitler. 4. Reject as propaganda any writing that affirms the Holodomor, that the Moscow trials were frame-ups, that Stalin had people shot, that collectivization was not necessary, that industrialization was brutal or didn't work. 5. Avoid all Trotskyist accounts about the Soviet Union, including about Lenin, Stalin, socialism in one country, or about Trotsky himself. No Trotskyist questioned the cult of personality around Trotsky himself. No Trotskyists strive for objectivity. All Trotskyists fall afoul of confirmation bias. I discussed confirmation bias at the beginning of the talk, right? 6. Avoid specifically the site Marxist.org unless there is some text on that site that cannot be gotten in digital format anywhere else. 7. Reject any so-called Marxist theory that is not based on practice. That means that all theory that assumes the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev lies about Soviet history of the Stalin period is false and has nothing to offer. Sure, there may be a needle of truth in the haystack of empty verbiage, but it'll take too much time to find it if it's there at all. Only theory based on an accurate understanding of the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin years can possibly have anything beneficial to offer those of us who want to learn from the successes and the failures of the Soviet Union in order to do better next time. 8. Remember why all these anti-communist, anti-Stalin lies and propaganda exist in the first place. They exist because of the magnificent achievements of the Stalin years in the Soviet Union. To name just a few: collectivization of agriculture, ending the 1,000-plus year cycle of devastating famines; industrialization, accomplishing in little more than a decade and entirely without foreign investment, relying solely on the Soviet working class and peasantry; the defeat of the Nazi hordes and their allies; the worldwide spread of the communist movement through the Comintern; the fight against racism, very important, right? The fight against racism was pioneered in the Soviet Union. The fight against discrimination against women. Okay, today is International Women's Day, right? This is where it was a holiday, and the only place it was a holiday until in the 1960s. Provision to all workers of inexpensive housing, inexpensive public transportation, free education, free higher education, annual vacations, universal medical care, retirement and old age pensions. These are some of the magnificent results of the Stalin era in the Soviet Union. That's why it's attacked. The successful fight against the imperialism of the so-called democracies, democratic capitalist countries, the big boost to unionization of workers in industrial countries, forcing the capitalist states to provide some degree of social welfare benefits for working people in order to blunt the attraction of the communist movement. These are just a few of the reasons why pro-capitalist and phony leftist pseudo-scholars falsify, distort, and just plain lie about Soviet history of the Stalin period. Now, the Bolsheviks, under both Stalin and Lenin, made many errors. Error is inevitable in all human endeavor. In fact, trial and error is the heart and soul of the scientific method, of materialism itself. In this sense, error is not a mistake. Error is an essential part of the study and mastery of reality. Unfortunately, the errors of the Bolsheviks resulted not only in great accomplishments, they also resulted in the blunting and aborting of these accomplishments in their only partial or fragmentary fulfillment. In the end, these errors resulted in the advent to power of people like Nikita Khrushchev and those who followed him, who abandoned the fight for communism. Finally, these errors resulted in the reversal of the gains of the October Revolution and the reversion to exploitative capitalism in all the countries that had once been socialist, or that had been striving, however imperfectly, towards socialism and communism. We have to learn both from the magnificent successes and from the tragic, but perhaps inevitable, failures of the communist movement of the 20th century, if we are to do better in the future. Because of my research, communists from many countries contact me. Other people too, but sometimes they're abusive, but the communists are interested. Okay. I know that there is a great hunger among millions of working people, students, intellectuals, and others all over the world for another international communist movement, for a class of society free from the horrors of capitalist exploitation. If we are to play a role in bringing that new worldwide communist movement into existence, and then moving forward to defeating capitalism and winning a classless communist world, we must discover the real history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. We have to learn the Bolshevik successes and their failures. I try to keep this noble goal in sight as I do my research. I thank you for supporting me in this effort. Thank you.
I got some books here. I didn't send a big stack of all of my books. Very heavy. I hope in the summer when I come, I'll be able to ship some more. I have a flyer here that lists all the books and the prices and how to order them. And after Gene has said what he could say, I have copies of an article.
I have copies of an article that I published a few years ago in a journal, the Journal of Labor and Society, which is a sort of summary or précis of my book Yezhov versus Stalin, which is about the Great Terror, okay? Not everybody wants to read a whole book. Not everybody wants to spend $15 or whatever it costs. I made up a whole bunch of copies here. I'll be glad to sell it to you for $2. If you can't afford $2, then give me $1 or 25 cents or whatever you can. It's digestible. It's only 20 pages long. You know, you'll get the essence of it. And I should do more stuff like this instead of writing these long, long books. But anyways, I have that too. So thank you. Gene is going to have some things to say. And then maybe we'll do question and answer, I think, something like that.
Yes, I do have some things to say. And we will definitely do question Q&A as well as comments, which Raj will handle. But I also want to say a couple of things about what is coming up. Next week, we have our very own David Ewing, who will talk about Cold War Chinatown. He says that he'll talk about the long battle from the 1930s till now between communist and KMT supporters in China, Reds were hunted and deported. It involved intelligence operations by the CIA and Taiwan CIA. There are several unsung heroes in the Chinatown Wars. Pro-PRC forces are dominant today, but Taiwan agents remain active. So that'll be next week. I think it'll be splendid. So put that on your schedule. We have some flyers there. Also, Grover inspired me by talking about how Marxists behave badly. But then I thought, well, how should Marxists behave? So I wrote this little piece, or I'm going to talk on Marxists behaving properly or correctly. Xi Jinping, Bernie Sanders, and the end of the age of Trump. And I think there is the question whether the age of Trump will end with a bang or a whimper. And here what I want to do is apply the principles of the scientific socialism of Marx, Engels, and Lenin to the question of how will we get rid of Trump in the light of, first of all, the American primary elections, and secondly, the rise of China as number one. So that's coming up. But before you can listen to any of these or ask any questions of Grover, we need to pass around the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library hat, and I've been told I suck as a person who gets people to donate large sums of money. So do you want to say anything, Rich, or do you want to say more? Okay, just give us all your money. Okay.
I would like to start off by making a donation of $100 to the library and to the ICSS, and I urge you to contribute as well. Thank you.
We do not have a checking account.
Write a check to me, and I'll send them the money. Seriously, and I'll give them the money.
You can make it out to the library.
All right.
People come from Marxist Library, and in the notes section say for ICSS.
Okay. All righty.
Cash is very much acceptable.
Well, they're asking about checks.
Yeah.
I'd like to briefly respond to Eugene's indirect or not specific reference to me and Raj on his question of how he pitches, and I think he does a great job. Okay, yeah, thank you. So that's my instruction to other people. So my point is that there's around 20 people in the room right now. I need to do another count. I always count the money. We spend about $75 every Sunday for the room. And so if there's 20 people and you give $3 each on the average, not counting the 100 from the main from the speaker, it'll almost break even. My point is often, yeah, that's the basic math. If 3 people on the average gave, 25 people gave $3 each, which is an average room maybe, but sometimes we have 10, 12 people, less often now. Sometimes we have 100 people. So average is average. Y'all understand that. So if you feel tight and you can give $3, as far as I'm concerned, you've done your moral responsibility. Yeah, but it's a big deal because we're about 1,000. Eugene did mention it, about 1,000 behind right now from the last couple of months of this year. So we want to not give the appearance that we're just great, everything's cool, we all smile and come have coffee and do a great lecture and go home. And no, we need to stay ahead of our budget. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry. Shall I? So at this time we're going to do Q&A and comments. I think.
Yeah, we're going to go for that. And I think everybody gets 2 minutes. That's not a restriction on your, but it's a restriction on the audience so that everybody gets a chance. 2 minutes for the question or comments. And please try to keep it to the subject matter today. So with that, let's start. We will start from, as I do usually, from the front row. Gene, you're the first one to go.
Okay.
Thank you, Grover. As expected, this was a very interesting and encyclopedic statement and review of the facts. I think it's really important. I know there's this book, the Black Book of Communism, and I examined that book and tried to figure out what is their methodology for saying that 100 million people died. And basically, they went a pretty comprehensive survey. Whenever anybody said anything bad about the Soviet Union, they wrote it down and said, oh, somebody traveling through the Ukraine said there was a famine with maybe 10,000 people were getting ready, were affected. So they write down 10,000, then they find another one, and so on and so forth. They just add up everybody that anybody has ever claimed. That's their methodology. And one doesn't have to be a rocket scientist to know that's not adequate. So, but thank you very much for the detail you bring.
Shall I make a brief comment about that? Okay, so there are a number of kinds of books written. Let's leave the articles aside for a second. There are a number of books written about the Soviet Union, Soviet history, particularly during the Stalin period. There are those books that are written by scholars, by academics, more or less for other academics, and there are plenty of those that are problematic too. They run afoul of these kinds of criticisms that I've made here. But then there are many other books that are not really written for other academics. They're written so that they will directly or indirectly get into the mass media. Okay, reporters or journalists or writers will pick these up and will write and propagate, spread these facts, these lies to a much broader audience. For example, Google's got my number. Maybe it's probably got your numbers too. But Google's got my number. And whenever I get on Google and I look for the weather in my town or here, there's a whole bunch of recommended sites. And yesterday there were two of them that viciously attacked Stalin and said that he killed 25 million people and all of this kind of stuff. One was from the Atlantic Monthly. So where do they get their stuff from? They get their stuff from books like many of the ones I wrote about, like Stephen Kotkin's book and many other books that are not really addressed to academics, but addressed to those people who will spread these lies abroad. And the Black Book of Communism back in the 1990s was exactly this kind of book, right? Its intent was not to impress anybody in the academic world. Academic scholars, even the most anti-communist of them, don't quote it. They never use it, just like they never cite Solzhenitsyn. These works are used as a source for journalists to spread anti-communist propaganda. Journalists don't have time to do research, even if they knew how to do it. They don't have time to do it, right? They go and journalists quote from legitimated authorities. Whatever is considered a legitimate authority, if the journalist quotes it, then that's, or cites his sources for that or her sources from that, that's all they have to do. And that's why a great deal of this propaganda is spread. I quoted some howling falsehoods from Marxist.org, but Marxist.org isn't written for scholars of the field. It's written to spread these falsehoods about Stalin and, of course, praising Trotsky to a much broader audience that doesn't have the means or even the understanding to go out and check those facts. All right. So that's a whole area of writing that has a big impact, all right, but could not withstand even scrutiny by anti-communist academics in the field. So I just wanted to comment on that because that's the kind of work that the Black Book of Communism is, right? And Gene said, well, we can all see through this, but actually most people can't see through it. They don't know. They haven't been taught how to critically analyze this material. Okay.
Along the same lines that you said right now, anytime I do a research on the internet. I hit one of those Trotskyist sites, like Marxists.org, for example, are getting bigger and bigger. Why don't we have the real Marxist site which can answer all of these questions that are raised by the sites like Marxists.org?
Good thing. Why don't you do that? I mean, that'd be great. Go do it. I'm all for that. I mean, my articles are up there, but yeah, I think that the anti-communists have a big head start, and it's not just anti-communist. I mean, if you're a capitalist, you have a good reason to be an anti-communist, right? The liars have a big head start. That's the problem, and. Oh, Marx to Mao. Oh, yeah. But Marx to Mao is a collection of texts. It doesn't go about refuting falsehoods. So, that is something that's going to take a while before these ideas filter out there. Nevertheless, it's beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen. Oh, okay.
They have interviewed you there, I know, in England. That's with the CPGB ML. Yeah.
Is that available on YouTube? Yes, if you heard Proletarian TV.
Okay.
You will get their programs, and their programs are pretty good.
Yeah, I did give a talk last summer to that group in London. So yeah, sure. I mean, you don't want to fall off. You don't want to fall off the horse on the right side, but you also don't want to fall off the horse on the left side, right? We don't want to be uncritical and in denial about negative things that happened in the Soviet Union either. I tried in my talks and I try in my books not to do that. It's important to be objective and to tell the truth. You can't be a Trotskyist unless you kind of worship at the shrine of Trotsky, but we don't want to do that from the other side. We don't want to do that with Stalin or with anybody, right? We don't want that kind of thing. That's why I started off this talk. The very first thing I talked about was the need for objectivity. If you don't have that, as far as I'm concerned, you really can't, nobody can perform a useful function. You're going to end up falling afoul of confirmation bias. You're going to find material, you're going to cherry pick evidence, as the expression goes, that tends to confirm your preconceived ideas, and you're going to look with great skepticism on anything that doesn't. And that's the end of a scientific view of history, right? So and I know maybe I bored you a little bit, but I wanted to quote from Marx and quote from Engels about the need for and Lenin about the need for objectivity and the need to understand what correct practice is in order to come to good theories, in order to understand reality, because we can't change reality unless we understand it. And these falsehoods and lies are preventing us from understanding reality, and therefore we can't change it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I want to just make a very quick announcement first. If any of you are KPFA members, there's a ballot going around for a new set of bylaws. I urge you to vote no. I'm on the KPFA local station board. If you want to talk to me more about it, see me after the program, but please vote no. Back to Grover. Thank you so much for this summary. It was really pulled everything together. The question I have is, if I'm aware of somebody who did something bad, they usually don't want to admit it. They say, no, it wasn't me, especially children and many adults. So the question I have is, during the Yezhovshkina and even the Moscow trials, a lot of the defendants apparently, once they were, arrested and evidence, they confessed, it seemed like fairly readily. The one person who did not confess, I think, was in Spain, Andres Nin, who was part of the Trotsky group that did the revolt against the Republic in Barcelona. Apparently he refused to confess. But I'm wondering, what is it that led these defendants, Bukharin and Tukhachevsky and Yezhov, to eventually confess? Because what was in it for them? Why would they have agreed to confess? And I mean, you say there's no evidence they were tortured, which we don't really know, but what do you think led them to confess?
We do know, I think we can say confidently that they weren't tortured, and I have analyze the evidence in some of my books, like the Moscow trials as evidence, for example. You asked about Bukharin. Okay? Bukharin's very interesting. I mean, it's a very interesting case. He denied guilt, denied guilt, denied guilt, denied guilt. When there was a Central Committee plenum in February, and it bled over into March 1937. And Bukharin's case, Bukharin and Rykov, but let's talk about Bukharin. Their case was first. And Bukharin says there that he had not been under arrest. He had been living at home, and every day the NKVD was sending him transcripts of confessions of statements made by people who were close associates of his, who were accusing him. And he even says in that beginning of that plenum that on one day he received 20 of these alone. So there was a tremendous amount of evidence against him. Now, he still didn't confess. He was put in an interesting moment, which I do discuss in detail in Stalin Waiting for the Truth, when Bukharin and Rykov's testimony and that part of the plenum came to an end. Stalin, who was the secretary, and he wasn't the chair, the chair decided that there should be a commission to go and discuss what we're going to do with them. What are we going to do with Bukharin and Rykov? And they went off someplace. They came back and reported. And they reported that we should imprison them, okay, until we do more investigation. When the Soviet Union came to an end and some of these documents came out, some of the documents of that commission came out, were published, and in fact Getty has it in one of his books. But also Kotkin refers to it. Kotkin lies about it. Getty actually talks about it frankly, and he reproduces the document itself. So what happened was the commission, which included Kollontai, for example, included Krupskaya, Lenin's widow, included a number of the people on the Politburo and Central Committee, were polled to recommend what should happen to Bukharin. And several of them said, well, he should be shot. And others said, he should be sent to a camp. Stalin said he should be exiled to some city. Just exiled, okay? In other words, sent outside of Moscow and live in some other city. But he was a couple of other people voted for it, but he was outvoted. And so when the commission came back, they decided to imprison him. In other words, it's sort of the middle ground. And they they voted unanimously ultimately. So it didn't come out until the end of the Soviet Union that Stalin was actually supported the least punitive, and not even for imprisoning him, right? Just for exiling him. The least punitive steps be taken against Bukharin and Rykov. And he was outvoted, clearly, and a middle position was taken. So this is one of the issues that came up. Bukharin continued to deny up until June the 2nd, 1937. And then he reversed himself, and he just said one day, there's so much evidence against me now, and then he confessed. My Moscow colleague, Vladimir Bobrov, and I published the text of that confession, Bukharin's first confession, in 2010, 2009, translated it into English, and we published it along with the commentary. It hadn't been published before that. We found that in the Volkogonov archives. There was a general in the late Soviet period, a friend of Gorbachev's, a friend of Yeltsin's, and Dmitry Volkogonov, who was a very anti-communist guy, who did a lot of research. He wrote a lot of bad stuff. And he got access because of his high position and his contacts to the Soviet archives. He didn't go in himself. He got lots of minor, research aides to go in and they could take any documents they wanted. They could just take in any and photograph them, photostat. When he was about to die of cancer, which he did in 1995, he smuggled this archive of Xeroxed materials abroad. And they were to England, where they were microfilmed, and then a copy was given to the Library of Congress, and you can borrow this. So 15 years ago or so, I think I could only borrow 3 reels at one time or something. And eventually I went through the entire Volkogonov archive, and I found this confession, which up until the last year or so was still secret in Russia. Now it's finally been, come out, but it was secret for a long time. And it's perfectly clear that he confessed because he just thought it was pointless anymore. Now, at the second Moscow trial, Karl Radek and Grigory Sokolnikov, who were Trotskyists, who were defendants in the trial, had, before the trial come out, before they were put on trial, they had come out and voluntarily, they were arrested, but they started to make confessions. And they weren't sentenced to death. They were sentenced to imprisonment. So it seems pretty clear that Bukharin was hoping that he would get, that because he did confess to a number of crimes, that he would also be sentenced to imprisonment and not death. However, and we have, oh, by the way, we have his appeal of his death sentence. He actually wrote 2 appeals. He was allowed to write 2 appeals, and we have them both. They were published in 1992. They've been republished since then, and they were identical. And he says in that appeal to the death sentence, listen, please let me go to exile, let me go to the United States, I'll write propaganda against Trotsky, I'll support the regime, I'll do whatever I can do. But he says in that statement, he says, yes, I refuse to confess to a number of crimes, but I confess to other crimes. For the crimes of which I confessed, I should be shot 10 times over. That's what he says. So the chances that he was forced into this, I mean, I don't think so. Also, in the Moscow trials, I was talking with John about this a little earlier today. In the third Moscow trial, Bukharin spends about 3/4 of all of his testimony, and he testifies more than anybody else in the third Moscow trial, denying certain charges that the prosecutor was named Andrei Vyshinsky, that the prosecution was trying to pin on him. And he resolutely denied it over and over again. But, as we show in our article, he also confessed to certain very serious crimes. Okay? So it's not like he was denying everything. He was just denying certain crimes. For example, he was accused of plotting to have, with the left socialist revolutionaries, to have Lenin assassinated. And he resolutely denied that. Okay? So he spent a lot of time, 75% of his time at least, denying certain charges. But he agreed to these other charges. He didn't deny those. Now, if he had been being threatened with torture, or if his family had been threatened, why would he spend 75% of his time denying these charges, right? That had put their necks in a noose, so to speak, right? It's not credible that he was forced to do this. And of course, we have now lots of these confessions by people who are his associates, his co-conspirators, who confessed against him and named him. We have a lot of that stuff, and more comes out all the time in Russia. So, but the anti-communists always take their refuge in saying, well, all of this stuff is from torture, or is from threats to them, threats to their family, or that business that comes up in Arthur Kessler's novel Darkness at Noon. His character, who's supposedly modeled on Bukharin's, guy named Rubashov. So the Rubashov confession is, the Rubashov explanation is, oh, they came to me and they said, oh, you have to do this for the party. Don't you love the party? Won't you do this for the party? And Rubashov does it for the party. That was what Arthur Kessler dreamed of, right? But that was false too.
Just one thing on the same thing. He mentioned Andrei's name. Yes. As to my knowledge, he was not in any of the Moscow trials.
No.
I do write about Andrei's Nin, but by the way, in several places. I have an article which I did not bring copies of, but there's a pre-publication draft on my webpage. Let me just say something about pre-publication. What that means is, if you publish an article in a journal like this, they really want you to go out and buy a copy of the journal. Okay, so they don't want you to put the article on your webpage for 2 years. So my article that deals with Nin and the Spanish Civil War and so forth, and Trotskyism, was just published in 5 or 6 months ago. But they do allow you to put a pre-publication draft, not the final draft with this format, but a pre-publication draft on your own webpage, not all over the place, but on your own webpage. They permit that. And then after 2 years, you can put a facsimile of the original article. So the 2 years has expired for this article, but it's going to be another 18 months or so before it does. Andres Nin was, he was very close to Trotsky. What I argue in that article, I think there's a lot of good evidence of it, that the Soviets knew that the Trotskyists in Spain were involved with German intelligence in some way. But that's all they knew. And they, of course, Marshal Tukhachevsky and others had also confessed to being involved with Trotsky and the Germans. So they suspected that Nin, who is the head of this party called the POUM, right, the Workers' Party, Marxist Party, a pro-Trotskyist party, they assumed that he probably was involved with the Germans as well. There's no hard evidence that he was, but they assumed that he was. They thought that he might be because of the Tukhachevsky trial, which had taken place just a few weeks beforehand, before Nin was kidnapped. And they had lavishly confessed to being involved with Trotsky and with the Nazis and so forth. So Nin got involved in all of that. And I talk about that in that article. If you want to read more about it and take a look at the evidence involved, you can download it from my webpage. It's towards the top because it's my most recent article. But that's the case with Andres Nin. And of course, he had been one of Trotsky's secretaries before he left the Soviet Union. Sure. Okay, I know that's a long-winded story, but there's some specific details that it's hard to talk about some of these things without getting into them a bit.
Yeah, thanks so much for your presentation and your books. I've read parts of all of them I bought, but I haven't read the whole thing for some reason. But anyway, here's the thing that sort of bothers me. And I know you probably don't, I think we've talked about this before. Because I was there 6 different tours in the 80s. And I took tours, and I've been to about 40 different cities, including, Siberia and all through Ukraine and everywhere. I've been everywhere there. The what do they call the Middle Eastern ones, like Baku and all those. And everywhere I went, I felt like they sure got it better than we do. And, and everybody says, oh, it all folded. It all folded. It got worse and worse and worse. Well, I don't know. I mean, I felt everywhere I went, everybody was talking about, oh, my apartment's only $5, 5 rubles a month. And, bread is really cheap and, there's a lot, blah, blah, blah. They had, we don't get enough fruit and stuff like they have down south. But, there was stuff, but basically people were doing really well. They looked good. They looked good on the street. Every year they looked better. And I thought things were getting better. I was really upset when it all folded. And that's what makes me feel like, why did it, I feel like there was some millionaires there that somehow had made some money and were working with some people in the U.S., and including Gorbachev, of all people, which everybody just loved him. Everywhere I went, people loved Gorbachev. But anyway, they didn't, what do you know until it happens? And, so anyway, I just feel like, and then, I wrote that book. I sold all 70 of them, and haven't really brought any more. I should get some more so people can see it, but just basically telling, how I felt. And I wanted to say one thing about Stalin. I had a tape back in the 80s, I guess it was, from a woman from Czechoslovakia, a Jewish woman in Czechoslovakia, who told all about how Stalin helped thousands from Jews in Czechoslovakia escape from Hitler and go to the Soviet Union, and they have a place there. I can't remember the name of it, but it's like their Israel. People don't know this, and they were brought there and put to work and had homes and the whole thing. And Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, I want to second what Gigi said. Thank you for all the work you've done on the defeat, exposing the anti-communism in the Marxist. I just want to take issue with one thing you said at the end. I've said it before. You said that the socialist camp completely went over to capitalism, basically, and I think that we need another Grover Furr to expose that anti-communist thing about current-day Russia. To me, it's no accident that the imperialist countries view Putin's Russia as a mortal enemy. And I think we need to see how, to the extent that Russia and the other members of the Eurasian bloc and the CSTO are trying to learn from the mistakes and the achievements of the Soviet Union to create a new society and keep moving forward. And I think we need to learn how to act in solidarity with them and defeat this new anti-communism in a new, has a new guise. It's not the old anti-communism. We can't even call it anti-communism anymore. It's something else. But it learns its lessons from the old anti-communism. And any rate, so I'm looking around for the scholar who can do the work that you've done in reforming that history and to help to do what needs to be done in the present day. But thank you so much for what you've done.
Hey, Grover. So there was an article in the West County Times within the past year or so. I think that they took it out of the New York Times or something. That Putin mourned the loss of the Soviet Union. That was in this paper, West County Times here. I think that's impressive for that to happen. I mourn it too, but they didn't write an article about me doing that. I wanted to find out if people here. By the way, aus mein Fort kein Sevastopol ist nicht weit von Simferopol, dorten ist a Stanzia voran. That's where the Jewish community was in Russia. Having farms. Look, Aunt Esther drives a tractor. Yeah. It's a wonderful song. I don't know the whole thing, but you don't want to hear the whole thing anyway. Yesterday, going back to what our leader Gene said, poor guy, he doesn't want it, about today being a celebration of the socialist struggle, the women's movement being there. That's how she started out her presentation. Marcia Feinlein, you know her, yeah? No? Anyway, how many people are registered Peace and Freedom Party here? Yeah, you get the chance to vote for a virtual socialist, virtual. And I'm always disappointed to come to a gathering like this and find out that we don't have registration in an effectively socialist communist party that is on the ballot. She's wonderful presenting that. Yeah, I think that pretty much gets what I had to say about it.
Grover, good to see you. Could you elaborate, or perhaps someone else in the audience, upon the errors that you correctly brought up? We really do need to be forthright about them so that rather than sweep them under the rug.
Well, I think he wants something a little bit more specific. I think. Well, I mean, I'm going to be very brief. Okay. I think that the Soviet Union during the Stalin period followed Lenin's precepts for, insofar as he had a blueprint, they followed it. Of course, he didn't have a complete blueprint, and he couldn't possibly, because he didn't have a crystal ball. Nobody can predict the future. It was too complex. But as best they could, they followed the guidance of Lenin and Marx and Engels, and they implemented that version of socialism. And clearly, that version of socialism was fraught with contradictions. It's easy to see in hindsight that ultimately a privileged stratum arose, partly not the old privileged stratum, but a new privileged stratum. It's also easy to see, I think, that there was that difference in income played a corrupting force, or a difference in there's also the issue of an emphasis on production of things, of goods, of weapons, of other goods, versus a production of communists. Now, Stalin actually, without going into the details, Stalin was actually very concerned about this problem. And there's lots of evidence that he was. But he didn't get his way. It didn't hit the mass communist instruction didn't take place. They also had this concept of socialism, perhaps inherited from the Second International, that socialism, if properly put into effect, would evolve into communism, sort of by a multi-stage process, or perhaps there weren't even going to be stages. If you read the transcript, which you can't do because it's not in English, of the 19th Party Congress. The 19th Party Congress was 1952, October 52, 5 months before Stalin died, less than 5 months. It was all about taking the next step towards communism. Okay? Now, we don't know how that would have worked out, because Stalin died and they put the brakes on that. It's the only Congress that the party ever had that they never published the transcript from. You can get a lot of the speeches out of Pravda, which is where I got them. So there were a number of issues. Clearly, there were people in leading positions in the party who were all for a powerful society. They were all for that, but who enjoyed their positions of authority, and were not really interested in moving the society towards more and more egalitarianism. And just the last thing I'll say, someplace in that book, Molotov Remembers, Molotov's interviewed by Felix Chuyev. I haven't read the English version, but there's a somewhat longer Russian version, which I'm pretty conversant with. Towards the end of that book, so it was probably in the 70s or 80s, Molotov's told him, socialism is irreversible. We can decide about, we can agree with that, which of course was not true, but that's what he thought. And I think that's what a lot of them thought. But he said we should be getting more and more and more egalitarianism. The inequality should be being gradually reduced, and instead they were gradually increasing. And he says that. I think that these are some of the considerations that we need to pay close attention to. Now, that sounds very glib, and I'm afraid I don't want to go on about it, but simply to say that doesn't solve the problem. Okay, how to motivate people motivating people is very important. Okay, motivating people by other than giving them more rewards. And I think that, and I don't want to reduce the Soviet Union to that. I don't want to reduce the energy and the dedication of the Soviet working class, men and women, and many others, to working towards a more egalitarian society, which they thought was going to happen. And I just end up with one final thing. But I think we have to learn from some of those lessons, okay? That we have to do it very differently the next time. A big barrier to that is this anti-Stalinism that said, oh, you know, that's what Khrushchev said. It's also what Trotsky said. And others have said it. Oh, if only Lenin had lived, or if only Trotsky had taken control, or what like that, then, you know, it's all Stalin's fault. And it wasn't all Stalin's fault. That's not what, it's a much more systematic. It's a much more systematic weakness in the vision of socialism that was the left version of what in the world at the time, but we can see now contained fatal contradictions. So we need to work more about that. By the way, there's one final anecdote. In the New York Times some years ago, there was an article. It's one of these towns, some town in the Soviet Union, that they dug up a time capsule. You know what a time capsule is, right? From 1967. Isn't all that, you know, not the Stalin period, much beyond. And these it was done by the young pioneers, like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. So they dug up this material, and they had souvenirs and stuff, and they had some documents, and the documents are you know, very moving. The children said, we are so envious of you who will read this document in the future, for you will be living under communism. Okay? We know that you will be living under communism. That's what we are striving for. So that even though the leadership at this point, I think, demonstrably was not interested in communism anymore, that became evident. But many, many people in the population were devoted to this goal and thought incorrectly that they were evolving towards it.
Oh, no, I just had. I'm sorry. Do you want to give it? Oh.
I don't know that. I don't think I need a microphone. I would just like to say, add to what you said, is that, in my opinion, the demise of the Soviet Union represents the victory of the Nazis over the Soviet Union. And that it's the ultimate, because among those 25 or 30 million people who perished were their best cadre, all of them. Right. And they were unable to recover from that. Right. Well, that's certainly a part of it. Needs to be considered, yes.
Just first of all, I think it was really great and helpful that both of you addressed the issue of International Women's Day, not just because it's today, but because you gave a little bit of the history and the actual source of the development of International Working Women's Day. And it was International Working Women's Day through the socialist and communist movements. And knowing that history helps us be analytical and critical of the way some aspects of International Working Women's Day has become a non-class event, meaning, you know, if you're a woman, you're part of International Working Women's Day, even if you're in the ruling elite or whatever. So just a quick comment. Secondly, all the details are really important. I can't absorb them every second. I mean, you have to read it over, you have to learn it. But it does help deal with what's obviously we've all been fed. What I think is important for us in doing that is to think about what's the, quote, popular reflection of these lies. And I'll just make one example. Anti-Stalin, you know, Krugman dropped it in a debate with Wolf on the radio twice. But one of the underpinnings of anti-Stalinism, which is applied, is the concept of great man history, which clearly when you learn the facts about the collective and the struggles within the collectives in the Soviet Union. It's not great man history. So whenever we hear great man history, we may not hear anti-Stalinism, but we should be alert that that's one of the sources of it. So.
I got skipped at the beginning of row 2. Hello. Always get accused of eating my words. So first of all, I don't know if I'm asking a question, but I'm going to make a brief, if I can keep it brief, statement, which is thank you very much, first of all. I've been waiting for this today, or at least the way I heard it. And so I guess I'm asking everyone to think about, I don't know if that little thing you read from is available, but I'd love to have it, you know, the 10, 20-page version versus the latest book, but I'll get them both. And that is that I think we should think about this, all this work Grover's done up till now, in a context of today, of 2002, of the election of the, you know, whoever gets it, whichever party, all that stuff. You know, we don't know right now. We could have Trump. In under 4 years, we could have some Democrat. We don't know who they're going to be. Probably fit the paradigm. I mean, hit the generalization that both parties do capitalism one way or another, but sometimes holding hands. But my point is that when you go out on the street, however many thousands of new members, however long they last, DSA's got right now, Democratic Socialism, Bernie, all that stuff. To me, this is a big point. Now, you start talking to somebody on the street, and they may or may not appreciate or relate to what you're saying about the difference between communists and socialists and social democracy and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people are trying to figure out, what the hell does this word mean? You know, I say 1 point to Bernie, Trump, and Hillary 4 years ago for putting the word, mainly Bernie, but I'm just saying, for fighting for it, for putting the word socialism back in the damn vocabulary where it belongs. You know, at least it's there. Now comes the question. Socialism, that's a word. What do you mean? Bernie socialism? Stalin socialism? You know, you get what I'm saying. So I would claim, depending on each person, I'm going to quit in 2 seconds, a reading of what's been said today, I would say it's a good start to start fighting anti-Stalinism and get down to the difference between the two, democratic socialism and all that. And for ourselves, individually, let alone to your friends and your comrades and your small groups. But out on the street, people want to know, what the hell? Why aren't you a communist? Why are you so? You hear me, so thank you. Thanks again.
I want to.
Yeah. Because we only have about 17 minutes, so.
Will do. Furr, I want to thank you. Many of us have been waiting for the kind of work that you've done for decades, even prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's commendable, and I personally appreciate your doggedness and your dedication to the line of work you've been doing. Also, the relationship between theory and practice. I think it's paramount for us to keep in mind that precisely for the reasons that you pointed out, we need to really delve into your books. We need to really study what happened historically, because we have to set a new direction for the general line of the Marxist-Leninist movement. The fall of the Soviet Union, I think, rests partly on some of the errors that you're discussing here, but it's important to, I think, for us to understand the role of revisionism, the ideology, the theoretical line that it took after the denunciation of Khrushchev to the so-called Stalinist era, and the maintenance of the peaceful transition and peaceful coexistence versus revolutionary path to communism. So I think it rests on us to apply and understand the meaning of practice in this context, and we have to practice putting ourselves in that revolutionary direction.
Robert, thank you very much for being here and helping us. For those of us who have been deprived of learning the truth, thanks for bringing the through history to us, so we are learning from you, and hope in the future our children will learn what is real. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you. I'm here to also to hear the what is the real about communists, because you always hear a lot of bad propagandas in the news, and I'm very interested to read your books and to understand a little more. Thanks.
Thank you. And that's her first time we introduced her. I would like to comment about that. The fact that the communist movement led in that time for Stalin and the Communist Party, the Red Army, and the whole Russian population defeat the Nazi Germany. And this is historical fact. And they did because they defend a society who was a society to fight and die for. That's the other reason why. Millions died fighting Nazi Germany and defend the new society. That's very important fact, history fact. And any society can accomplish that when was supposedly led by terror or by a cruel dictator. It's not happening in the history. And why they continued propaganda these lies? It's very easy to understand. Because capitalist class had to take away intellectuals and the whole working class away from those ideas, communist ideas. And that's why we need to continue to fight those lies. And the last question to you is, can you say something about how the stage of the class struggle in the actual Russia?
I'm in touch with people in Russia, mainly around the kind of research that I do. I don't know, they are obviously live there and know the conditions there. But there certainly are in Russia and in many, many other countries, but certainly in Russia, there are people who want to build a new communist movement. There are quite a lot of them. In many countries in the world, there are a larger proportion of the population than, let's say, in the United States. But certainly in Russia, there are a lot of people who are enthusiastic students and fans of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. There is a tendency to be uncritical of Stalin, right? To put Stalin back on the pedestal. But if you read my book Khrushchev Lied, you'll see that Stalin himself was very much opposed to the cult of the individual, the cult of personality, around himself too. And there's lots and lots of quotations, and I've found more since I published that book. So I think we need to, not to do that, but to get back to the historical truth. And there are many people in Russia today who want to do that as well. I would like this, as long as we got a few minutes, it's great to, it's very important to understand the history of the Soviet Union, what really happened, and to be able to see through the lies that are thrown at us all the time about the Stalin period. That's very, very important. But it's also important to understand capitalism, which is the enemy that needs to be overthrown. I would like to put in a plug to encourage you all to read Charlie Andrews' book, The Hollow Colossus, which I have recently read. I skimmed it some time ago. Didn't really get out of it what there is there, but it has a lot of very insightful analysis of the current crises of capitalism and how it cannot possibly evolve towards a better society. And he also has a all too brief outline of the kinds of goals that a true socialist, he calls it, a socialist movement should be struggling for. And he's one of you. here in Oakland. So you can ask him questions and so forth whenever you want. But I would like to encourage you to consider studying Charlie's latest book, which I think is really an eye-opening work. And I am planning, as soon as I can find the time, to write a review of it for some publication or other. Okay? Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'll be brief. First, statistics. When I was growing up, I heard that 10 million Soviet soldiers died, 10 million civilians. And then in recent years, I hear the total figures are 27 million. And I just wanted to comment on what's the significance of claiming one total over another. Okay, number one. Number two, I grew up in Oakland, and the way I learned about communism was through the Reader's Digest. Literally. And we should take that very seriously, because that's a major information source. It was back then. So anyway, number three, my uncle was an early draftee in World War II, and he was shipped to the Iran-Iraq area. And so that was the supply line, the Americans supplying the Soviet Union. And it's interesting, I read in the Gabriel Kolko book about that time period that Stalin at one time, because the Americans and the British were dragging their feet on opening the second front, he says, okay, send over American troops. You can fight alongside Soviet soldiers. And of course, we realize now the unreality of that, given the real commitments of the British and the Americans. But history might have been different if that had happened. And finally, when I was in graduate school, one of the reasons we were intrigued by Soviet Russia was that they seemed to be wanting to promote the idea of a new type of person. We called it a communist man or something like that back then. And yes, socialist man, okay. And there's an interesting book I found on my bookshelf by a guy named Uri Bronfenbrenner, and he was an American, I guess, psychologist. And it's a book about Soviet education, and he has a whole section on the young pioneers and the posters that they would train the young pioneers with. Okay, anyway, it's very interesting, and it's very different from Capitalist Man.
Okay, thank you for the plug, Grover, and you said I was available locally for questions. I didn't know that, but I do now. Anyway, between 1929 and 1953 and 1929, this is a society that most people are farmers, right? And then by 1953, you have an advanced industrial country, challenging the U.S. on production parameters and so on. So, all that's happening by these people who are living under this dictatorship that Hitler didn't do so well with his economy, did he, by the end? And also, during that time, they did it, and they didn't feel during that time that they had to allow for the rise of billionaires, Jack Ma of Alibaba, also a member of the Communist Party over in his country. And they did it with millions of people leaving farms and going into factories in an organized way. They didn't have to, get pushed out by the power of the market and have to go sell themselves for whatever wage they could get in some city 500 or 600 miles away. And they did it without, having the workers make money for bosses by assembling Apple phones, letting Henry Paulson and Peter Peterson and Lazard Frères all share in the loot and so on. So I really think there's a lot to think about there in terms of how they did that without all those kinds of concessions.
Hi, I'm Nina. I just wondered, given the situation right now, do you have any comments on what a communist or et cetera would do, or is there anything to do, given the tumble of the stock market, which is, I think I was just looking up the facts of how many people are invested in the, the United States public in the stock market, and also this so-called election, which is something I don't think we should ignore. But I sort of, what would be your perspective about all of this as to what we might do here?
Well, I'm not a pundit, so I don't know if I have too much. I think it's pretty obvious that we need to build a movement, and in order to do that, we need to get involved with others in struggling for whatever reforms people are struggling with, and that we also need, we certainly need a communist party if we're going to have a revolution. Once again, Charlie has written an article that says in order to build socialism, something along the lines of in order to build socialism, we need a communist party or a socialist party. I don't remember the exact wording. He can tell you, and his article is on his webpage. So I think we ought to take very seriously the job that's what we need to do. We need to join with others in these various reform struggles, and we need to think seriously about building a new communist movement, which has to include the building of a communist party. That's what we have to do. I'd just like to say before we wrap up really quickly here, yes, there are some books of mine that I have for sale up here. Yeah, sure. I said, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to make a quick announcement. There's a reception at my house at starting at 2 until, and anybody wants to come, just see me. I got the address, I give it.
I urge you to come.
Reception for Grover.
I urge you to come. Everyone here is invited.
Right.
The Burries have been very kind to do this in the past. That they have wonderful food and drink and wonderful conversation, and I would urge you to come if you possibly can to.
Yeah.
Where is it? David.
Thank you. I think we're close to time, so I'll make it brief, and if we want to take it up afterwards offline, that's fine as well. I appreciate the title, Marxists Behaving Badly. I noticed in 2 weeks there's the counterpoint to that, Marxists Behaving Correctly. So it's getting at that tension or that sort of dialectic, as it were. I think of socialism and communism as aspirational, and I would think in that would be built in the moral, the philosophical component. I realize, politics and religion aside, people are humans are flawed, and every person in every system equally flawed. Can you address that sort of dissonance, as it were, an aspirational moral component?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I did quote from Marx and Lenin in my talk. Perhaps that's not what you have in mind. But of course, the impulse behind fighting against injustice and fighting for a better society is a moral impulse. But a moral impulse is not sufficient, right? We need a scientific socialism. We need Marxism, Leninism. We need a communist movement to make that a reality. And we also need a grasp of the truth. And that's very briefly what I'm looking for in my research, right? I'm not a Stalinist. I'm not saying everybody should, I'm not here to vindicate Stalin or anything. I've been looking for many years for these so-called crimes of Stalin, and they do not exist. Because if they existed, some of these anti-communist scholars whom I've studied would certainly have found them and have publicized them. But every time they say that there's some kind of Stalin and I've investigated, it turns out to be false. So I think that the pioneers in our movement, including Stalin and others, were pioneers, but they were not criminals. Okay. That having been said, we have to learn how to do it better next time. Walt was quite right in asking about the question that what did they do wrong? What do we need to do better next time? That's absolutely true. It doesn't emerge immediately from studying history. History is about what happened in the past, but the history, we have to know the historical truth so we can learn from it, so that then we can learn how to do better next time. And I said a few things very briefly about that, but Malt's quite right to ask that. We can't simply be satisfied in talking about what really happened in the past, right? Because ultimately this movement failed and we need to succeed. Okay, thank you.
The last point, I just wanted to refer you to Stalin's writing 1952, last writing on the economic problem of socialism. So obviously things went wrong afterwards, and that is a book. And then also Vijay Kumar Singh in India has written an article on the same subject. So those who are interested in that sort of economic aspect can go. Okay, so I got some books here for sale. I've got some articles. These are $2 a piece. I'd like to have one. Certainly. We have another